Welcome to this rapid revision video on the Paris Peace Accords, 1973. Before we get too ahead of ourselves, we should look at really the timeline for defeat in South Vietnam, because although the Paris Peace Accords were in 1973, it was all done and dusted in a very much not peaceful way by 1975. So let's have a look at how things panned out. In 1973, US involvement in Vietnam all but ended. The 27th of January 1973 saw the Paris Agreement, which set up a ceasefire between the USA, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese. This is shown in the picture that I had on the title screen for this with Henry Kissinger, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. But this wasn't to last. March 1975 saw the North Vietnamese army launch a full-scale conventional invasion of South Vietnam. It rather seems that they'd spent the 2 years since the Paris Accords, well, really planning this invasion. By the 30th of April 1975, Saigon fell. It's now known as Ho Chi Minh City. The last US advisors and troops were evacuated from the US Embassy in a last-minute and humiliating scramble. This is not Nixon's honourable withdrawal at all. But consider that, a conflict that had either been being fought or brewing for the best part of 20 years was all done and dusted within a couple of months. The North had won, Vietnam was united, and it had become communist. So if the Paris Peace Accords didn't actually achieve the peace that they set out to, what was their significance? What did they supposedly agree? Well, let's have a look. Here's that picture of Henry Kissinger and the representative for the North Vietnamese shaking hands as the deal was agreed. There had been several attempts to bring the North and South together, several attempts to make them agree, and several times one side or the other or both had walked out, sometimes over things as simple as the seating arrangements. But here's an opportunity for you to summarise the main terms that were in fact agreed at the Paris Peace Accords. It was agreed that Vietnam was to be reunified based on negotiations between the North, South and the Viet Cong. The USA agreed not to interfere. Bear in mind though, this was a reunification based upon negotiations, so it didn't specify whether it would be communist or not. The USA also agreed to no longer aid ARVN, that's the Army of the Republic of Vietnam or the South Vietnamese forces, but the fighting was to stop immediately. Prisoners of war and captured equipment would be returned in 60 days, and the USA would help pay for repairs in North and South Vietnam. Such payments are known as reparations. You might want to take a moment to list and summarise those different agreements now. So how did the US, South Vietnamese and Vietnamese aims differ in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973? The USA wanted the war to end and for its prisoners of war to be returned as soon as possible. Henry Kissinger had assured the US public that peace was near. South Vietnam wanted to keep US support and wanted Thie's government to remain in power. President Thie was the person in charge of South Vietnam at this time. They refused to bargain with the communists. That includes both North Vietnam and indeed the Viet Cong within South Vietnam. But then we have the communist aims. The Viet Cong wanted their provisional revolutionary government to have a say in the running of South Vietnam. In other words, for them to have a say along with Thie's government. The North Vietnamese wanted Vietnam to be united, but under a communist state. They planned to invade if this wasn't agreed, which might give us a few clues as to what happened later on. Let's make some final points then, but we'll do it in a slightly different way. This is a statement or a question that reflects the 12-mark answers that you might find in paper 3 of the Edexcel exam. So how do you build a point example explain linked paragraph? First of all, you've got to make your point. The Paris Peace Accords failed to secure peace in Vietnam. Then you can back this up with examples. An example of this failure to secure peace might be, neither side treated it as a peace agreement, just a ceasefire or break in the fighting. Thie's government refused to negotiate with the communists. The USA were prepared to abandon the South Vietnamese government if it meant ending the war, especially for them. You then explain what the effects or importance of this was. The North prepared an invasion of South Vietnam, which eventually took place in 1975, leading to the North's victory in the war. ARVN was not able to effectively defend South Vietnam without the US aid it relied on, including the help of civilian contractors and advisors. The US's forces left Vietnam, but thousands of civilian contractors and advisors remained. Then link it all back together. This meant that the Paris Peace Accords failed because the war continued after a short ceasefire, only ending after the North Vietnamese invasion and victory in 1975. So how do we put this into a single paragraph? Well, it might look something like this. The Paris Peace Accords failed to secure peace in Vietnam, An example of this failure to secure peace is the USA were prepared to abandon the South Vietnamese government if it meant ending the war. The effect of this was that ARVN was not able to effectively defend for South Vietnam without the US aid it relied on, including the help of civilian contractors and advisors. This meant that the Paris Peace Accords failed because the war continued after a short ceasefire, only ending after the North Vietnamese invasion and victory in 1975. If you followed that format for, say, 3 different examples, maybe 2 on the stimulus points you could be given and 1 of your own, and then conclude with what is the most important reason the Paris Peace Accords failed, then that would be a good way of getting full marks. But if that's all you need for now, then don't worry too much about it. That's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please like the video, and you can also comment with any suggestions for topics that I should cover next down below as well. Other than that, thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful and interesting, and thanks and goodbye.